Are we live? We're ready to go?
We're ready to go.
All right. So I guess I'll start out.
Okay.
I'm Joni Boyd Acuff.
I'm Dana Carlisle Kletchka. I'm an assistant professor in arts administration, education, and policy at Ohio State. And I run the museum specialization for education and administration. And I guess 2 summers ago now, Joni and I had a conversation after the Ape Shit video came out featuring Beyonce and Jay-Z. And I recall being in Finland at the time, and I was about to give a presentation on 21st century museologies. And I thought, you know, I saw this video the night before, and the next day I thought, oh my gosh, I could just show this video instead of doing my presentation. I did not do that. However, it was something that really moved me and affected me a lot and made me think about the work that I was doing. And not too long after that, Joni and I had a conversation where we thought that we might sort of pull together and bring our expertise together and think critically about the video itself and how we might incorporate it into some of the work that we were doing toward post-critical museologies and through Black feminist theory. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, is performing the museum with Beyonce and Jay-Z at the Louvre, specifically centering Black feminist theory and thinking about their Ape Shit video.
So I want to add that it was really important for Dana and I to acknowledge our positionality as a Black woman, and she is a white woman, coming together to think about the work of another Black woman. We really thought about how to negotiate our positions and support each other, but also as art educators, looking at visual, and museum educators looking at the ways that interventions are or can be set up in the museum. We want to make sure that we're clear that these are our interpretations of Ape Shit. I am you know, a Beehive member. However, you know, I'm open to critique about Beyonce, but I'm not here really to say how awesome she is. We're looking at the images and the statements that are being made with the bodies of Black women, and the and how they've been inserted into spaces that have been historically whitewashed. So just wanted to put that out there before moving on. This YouTube video link is there for you to watch if you haven't ever watched it before. It's about 5.5, 6 minutes long. And so usually we have time to just preview the video, but hopefully you were able to watch that before you came into this presentation. Next slide.
So, yeah. So when Joni and I were having these conversations, we sort of brought not only our positionality, but our past experiences, both in museums and working in museums and researching museums. And I was an art museum educator for a little over 20 years before I came to Ohio State. And anytime you research the history of museums, one of the things, of course, that you think about is the Louvre. It's definitely considered the first great national art museum. In the article, we talk a lot about it sort of being a representation of democracy, particularly after the French Revolution, where instead of, you know, sort of shutting down the King's Palace, they turned it into a museum for the people. And the way that they did that was by taking the sort of comprehensive collections, meaning art objects from all over the world, the sort of classical architecture, the careful placement of objects, and thinking about how they present particular narratives in what are called universal museums. That was a term that was sort of delineated in the 1980s about these grand buildings that sort of present a unitary narrative to the public who's coming in. And I think we all know the Louvre is it, right? The Louvre is the place where millions of people at least used to go every year to experience, sort of the best of what the art world has to offer. And so we thought a lot about how places like the Louvre and Universal Museums position visitors as passive recipients of these sort of civilizing narratives that are offered through display of canonical Western art objects, right? When you go into a museum, the 20th century work, the contemporary work is in a different gallery than 19th century European or the African work, or the way that they sort of think through presenting these exhibitions or these displays send a message to the people who are in the galleries and sort of observing these works. And so one of the things, of course, that is probably not surprising is that the narratives of the Louvre, as they've been presented in the past, largely exclude Black bodies. And that was one of the things we really wanted to talk about with Beyonce's intervention and how she absolutely includes Black bodies. And so there are a couple different theoretical frameworks that we use. Joni, do you want to talk about Black feminist thought and Mining the Museum, and then I'll follow up?
Yeah, so this slide is just giving you what theoretical frameworks we're going to be working with: Black feminist thought, mining the museum, performing the museum, and post-critical museology. And we have a brief description of all four of them. Next slide, please. So starting with Black feminist thought is a standpoint epistemology that takes into consideration and centers Black women's lived experiences and their lived realities. They help, it's old. I mean, it's been happening before it had a discourse, before it had the terminology, from enslavement. Black women have been working to do interventionist work. And so interventionist work around how they were treated, how they were defined, how they were represented. And so this theoretical framework allows us to see how Beyonce in this space establishes multiple representations of herself and uses cultural heritage as energy to resist daily discrimination. And this image is just a picture of Sarah Baartman, not just it is a picture of Sarah Baartman, which was a 16-year-old woman, teen from Africa, from South Africa. And she was taken from her home and put on display. They put on beads and feathers on her, and took her to Europe, and she was circulated as a part of the so-called freak shows. And so they promoted her as Hottentot Venus, and it was supposed to be in direct comparison to the Greek goddess, the white goddess, European goddess of love. But she was put on display because of her protruding buttocks. And so this was kind of one of the quintessential examples of how Black women were created to be inhumane outside of what is normal, what is natural or normal, aka white or European white. And this is really important because it gives you some historical reference to how Black women's definition of Black women have been created out of this white imagination, and then using this framework for Black feminist thought to think about how Beyonce tries to break out of that and counter those narratives that have been created based on this example and other numerous thousands of examples of how Black women have been created out of an imagination that is outside of actual reality. Next slide. Mining the Museum, it comes from Fred Wilson, and Fred Wilson was a Black male contemporary American artist. He's well known for this exhibition, Mining the Museum, where he juxtaposed, rearranged historical artifacts from the Maryland Historical Society's collection to make commentary on the history of slavery in America. His work encouraged viewers to consider how the environment and arrangement of specific arts and artifacts influences personal interactions with and interpretations of the work, the people and the era that it reflects. Scholars have suggested that the visual art and spaces that house art are significant in developing identity and culture because they display imagery that's assumed by society. So this suggests that museums have the power to curate not only exhibitions, but to craft and disseminate broader narratives about humans and humanity. And so his Minding the Museum, we thought this was important because he uses juxtaposition and he uses counter narratives to create these other curiosities. And so as we looked at the video, we thought that some of these same strategies, some of these counter strategies were being used by Beyonce, and we found it a necessary framework to position that work within that same framework that Fred Wilson put forward. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'll talk a little about performing the museum. Those are some of my favorite people in that slide, by the way. Charles Goroyan, who's a former professor at Penn State, in 2001 thought a lot about what he called performing the museum, which is essentially thinking about an embodied pedagogy where new museum myths can be imagined, created, and acted out as a form of personal meaning making. In this instance, we were really interested in the notion of performing autobiography, which is what we consider what Beyonce was doing. His notion sort of represents the memories and the cultural histories that all of us bring to museum culture as viewers. And that includes personal, anecdotal knowledge, by which you sort of create narratives to represent your own experiences of art. I think we've all been in a gallery where we looked at something and it made us think of an experience or a time or a moment or a person that maybe didn't have anything really to do with the content of the work, but those associations, those personal sort of autobiographical associations should be valued. And those are the ways that we create narratives to represent our own experiences of art. And so what we wanted to do was think about responding to the art in that way, to introduce content that usually remains hidden in museum experiences, and that is sometimes contrary to the dominant academic assumptions of museum pedagogy. For a very long time in art museums, we were quite concerned with making sure that people understood more about the artist or the art historical context or the materials that were used for some sort of work of art or installation. And while those are all critically important things, we're also very interested in, at this point, those understandings and those narratives and those beliefs that people bring into galleries with them. And so Dr. Acuff and I were really interested in thinking very deeply about those autobiographical performances that Beyonce was bringing in to this particular video. Let's go to the next slide, which I actually want to say this is from a book called Radical Museologies by Claire Bishop. But I wanted to talk very quickly about post-critical museology, which is an emerging theoretical framework for thinking about changes in museums, particularly this century, thinking about our changing understandings of representational systems and meaning, thinking about the way that staff at museums work together and individually as actors in a complex system of interactive communication. No longer are we considering museum staff, particularly educators and curators, as people who sort of set forth an agenda. We're thinking a lot now about the ways in which the community and the public communicates back. Another thing that's changed quite a bit in museum culture is thinking about the subjectivities of museum visitors. For a very long time, people thought about museum visitors in terms of their age or racial and ethnic background or socioeconomic status, when in fact those identities are in constant flux. There's no such thing really as a fixed category of race or gender or sexual orientation or immigration status. All of those things come together in different ways at different moments. Another thing we're thinking about a lot with critical museology, post-critical museology, is the ways in which technology and technical networks are radically reconfiguring the ways of communicating and knowing. I think it's particularly salient at this moment to think about the ways in which digital technologies and the way that we understand them are embedded in the work of museums and how we're utilizing them to communicate with visitors, particularly since many museums are not able to be physically open. But those technical networks are absolutely reconfiguring the ways in which we communicate and we know. And then thinking about the ways that museums have to re-examine their relationships with their communities, because everything that museums do are being challenged, right? The language in which they present their exhibitions, the cultures, the way that they are depicted, and the way that they have been part of the development of exhibitions, and even race and sexual orientation and gender identity. All of these things are fodder for re-examination at this moment, because museums have for so long taken a particular standpoint that doesn't include necessarily a lot of different people. So next slide, there we go. So Joni and I are gonna talk for a moment about what we did with Apeshit and Beyonce. Do you wanna go, Joni?
Sure. So this slide is just giving you the framework that we used. We talk about how Beyonce mines the visual legacies of Black women. So the visual legacies that have been created, particularly by Sarah Bartman's example and the countless others, and then, you know, mines using Fred Wilson's words. Beyonce enacts a critical curatorial intervention and embodies a post-critical perspective, and she performs a museum. So you see all of those theoretical frameworks being used to describe how Beyonce and Jay-Z's decision to insert their Black bodies and dozens of others, the dancers, in the museum serves as this curatorial endeavor, a way to depose of institutionalized narrative that never authentically affirmed Black people and their humanity. This music video interrogates implicit social political rules that are embedded within both normalized viewing of race beings and art museum curatorial practices. We suggest that this video constitutes a critical curatorial intervention, in that Beyonce's performance in the video mines the fixed visual legacies that bury the humanity of Black women and mines the museum in general as a site of institutionalized racism. I think that's it. Let's go to the next slide. So start talking about this. So I'll move us forward here, Dana. So moments of disruption that we're gonna be focusing on, we looked at the video, found so many times we looked at the video, we made screenshots, we took screenshots, unpacked the visual, and so we came up with these 3 themes that we saw happening throughout the video. And the moments of disruption that we came up with included positioning the Black female body as otherworldly and as art, juxtaposing living Black bodies and works of art, and presenting Black counter narratives to the narratives of the Louvre. So I'm going to start by doing the first thematic frame that we used, Black bodies as otherworldly. So stereotypes, visual representations of Black women facilitate this production of inequality. Black women have been historically and continually defined in ways that deny their humanity. So we saw instances where Beyonce tried to destabilize this narrative. In this first screenshot here, you see her dressed in this dramatic couture gown, and all throughout she wears these costumes, like these elaborate headdresses that mimic that mimic the stark white marbled goddesses, angels, and other statues that line the halls of the Louvre. So for example, at the beginning of the Ape Shit video, Beyonce, she casually sings at the ship's prow. This is the, say it, Dana, what, say it?
Oh, Nika of Samothrace.
Thank you. An ancient marble goddess of victory. And Beyonce's dressed as a goddess in a bulky, multi-layer white gown. Its lines and its contours mimicking the waves of an ocean. The elements of the moment, which is this staccato wrapping and the body placement layered with this white gown, they converge to evoke a spiritual element that can't be solidly defined as human. And Beyonce, even in her Lemonade visual album, and even in her latest song, she talks about Oshun. And Oshun is a Yoruba, it's from Yoruba religion. It's like a goddess, a deity, and it's typically associated with water and purity and fertility. And so that's an example of how, you know, she's trying to emanate this this aura that is outside of you know, humanity, who's outside of it, not in a inhumane way, but in a goddess-like way. A similar visual disruption occurs at the front of the Great Sphinx of Tanis. Did I say that right? I don't know these historical, I don't know how to pronounce some of this stuff. An ancient Egyptian sculpture you see on the right that combines the features of a lion with the king to create this powerful guardian. Beyonce and Jay-Z appear in the front of the Sphinx, illuminated in a sea of red light. And this time Jay-Z and the 24-ton statue look on as Beyonce begins to gesture to the repetitive beat of the song, in essence declaring ownership of the same space as the Sphinx. And she wears this flesh-colored bodysuit with a hat and a matching jacket, and the subtle spots on the leather kind of echoing in this feline sensibility in the presence of the sun. Over the course of the next several scenes, Beyonce dances more and more aggressively and eventually throws off her jacket and her hat. And the next time we see the couple with the Sphinx, they're joined by shirtless male dancers, still bathed in red light, moving casually, close proximity to the ancient sculpture. Led by Beyonce, they symbolically and enthusiastically claim their place in the eternal legacy of the Egyptian king. Next slide, please. So moving on to female bodies as art, throughout Ape Shit, Beyonce recasts historical dominant representations of Black women, including the sexual siren, the nurturing figure. I don't think these are the right notes, but I'll just talk off the cuff on this. So this image, it comes from a screenshot where Beyonce is kind of at the top of this staircase, and then her dancers are lined on this staircase, being really still. And, you know, when we first looked at this video, I didn't necessarily see some of the connections to bodies at the bottom of slave ships, which this also mimics. Like, there are multiple interpretations of this. But they also look like they could be hanging. I mean, there's so many things symbolism that can be connected to Black life in this space that hasn't necessarily, you know, honored Black life. And so it is, these bodies are still in kind of in sculptural positions like they are art. Next slide, please. There's another still of bodies in these very, in these positions that can be considered artistic, I guess. I mean, can you go to the next slide?
Joni, can I say something really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
with those women, I mean, if you watch the video, they actually, the way that they sort of move back and forth and enliven these stairwells, they really seem to meld and merge with the architecture. It's like they become the sort of living, breathing thing with the architecture of the museum. And then to see, you know, Jay-Z and Beyonce up there, it really is quite a spectacle. It's definitely something that you're gonna wanna to look at, because they are making a pretty strong statement about being part of the narrative of the Louvre.
So this is, okay, so this is the slide that I was looking for. So this is a key moment in the video when these statuesque bodies of Black female dancers undulate atop these pedestals in subtly lit galleries. The intentional placement of Black bodies on pedestals is crucial to observe and unpack. Collins suggests, who is the author of this book about African-American women in histories in the arts. She writes, "There's a visual legacy of the Black figure as servant in the shadows, laboring for white people and often attending to white women." So in the historical canon, the depiction of Black female body could not unequivocally signify the promise of freedom, for she was already too entangled in her charred flesh. So this picture, it took us a lot of time to try to stop grab this screenshot, because it's just very brief, and if you don't pay attention, it will pass you by really quickly. And you see that the silhouettes look like sculpture. They look like pieces of art within the museum. Also, though, other interpretations could be Black bodies on the block, the block to be sold. And so that is a really crucial and significant contradiction that happens as the Louvre is presented as this space that signifies this sort of oppression, this sort of harm and violence to Black bodies. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the juxtaposition of these living Black bodies, the dancers primarily, with works of art. So there were several instances where we looked through, and again, we did watch this video many, many, many times. It started coming in my dreams, so I think that was sort of significant, talking to me that way. So Black female bodies are in conversation with essentially white patriarchal power, and Beyonce explicitly asserts that Black female existence and Black creative products are cultural assets. So if we're looking at this, right, so we have Beyonce, 7 Black female dancers. Their bodysuits are very closely matched to the color of their skin, which I think is quite important in this instance. This is a massive painting behind them by Jacques-Louis David, the coronation of Napoleon, which is particularly significant in French history. And you can see the moment in the middle there. It's highlighted, of course, with light, where the king is putting a crown upon the head of his spouse. And in the painting, the couple are flanked by crowds of onlookers who are white, who are silent, who are still. And so there's this contrast, this juxtaposition between this sort of lush spectacle of royalty and this really beautiful, sensual, synchronized movement of dancers. They're vibrant and they're powerful. And so there's a purposeful placement of Black female bodies against the backdrop of the coronation of Napoleon. And we argue that it pushes against the Western socialization of the Black psyche and rejects the alienation of the Black body in visual art. So this juxtaposition recontextualizes the space, but it also challenges ideals about art that have historically erased and erased Black bodies, specifically female bodies. Let's go to the next slide. All right. This was another fun one. So another juxtaposition, and I'm thinking back about, you know, when I used to be in the galleries and working with people, and one of the things that I think is really important when you're in a gallery like this is to not just look at one work of art at a time, but to think about the ways that they're positioned together in order to create a narrative. And this is a really interesting example of that. So in this juxtaposition, we have two Black dancers who are clad again in these flesh-toned leotards. And they're posing on the floor in front of a really famous painting called Madame Recamier, again by Jacques-Louis David. So Madame, who is a white woman, lays sort of passively on this recliner in a long white dress, accepting the viewer's gaze with a slight smile. And the dancers sit in front of her. Interestingly enough, the stanchions are there, which I think is interesting. So there's sort of this barrier supposed to be keeping people away from it. But they are echoing her dress by wearing these long white headscarves that connect their bodies, and they mimic the shape of the couch. There's absolutely a sort of relationship going on there, a compositional relationship. And their brown limbs are echoing the structure of the curved arms of the couch. But the tension in this juxtaposition emerges in the effort that you can imagine of these dancers keeping these seated poses, one knee gathered to their chest, one leg extended, and that's this really sort of direct contradistinction to the relaxed pose of Madame Recamier. And I think it's also important to look at the men who are on the sides of Madame Recamier, because they appear to just sort of be looking down and observing, you know, checking out what's happening with the Black dancers in front of them, which I think is a really interesting and wonderful juxtaposition. So again, Beyonce has taken these narratives and said, okay, so I'm going to react against these in ways that sort of reinsert the narrative of Black female bodies into this space. Okay, so the next one. Okay, so here's another juxtaposition, one of my favorites, right? So we see essentially the Mona Lisa. I don't see the glass. I don't know if they took the glass off or they just digitally did something later on. But here we see a Black male and female, presumably a couple, who are sitting in front of the Mona Lisa, whom we all know and love. And she's lovingly combing the hair of her partner, which is not a gesture necessarily that you see in a museum a lot, but this closeness and warmth of these two bodies together and this tender gesture between lovers is elevated as an embodiment of tenderness that the Mona Lisa can never perform, even as she bears witness to it. So these juxtapositions, just these three, and there are many, many in the video, they offer starkly different narratives that are present in the work than are present in the work. And they really serve to remind viewers that there are lives and there are stories that are often overlooked in the galleries when you're walking through any museum really, but this one in particular. So next slide, please. So we also noticed some Black counter narratives to the narratives of the Louvre. Oh good, we're doing well on time. So Tori says that in an effort to destabilize dominant explanations and ideologies, people of color are encouraged to retell stories and construct historical counter narratives that speak more authentically to their lived experiences and their cultural frames of reference. So we're gonna go back to the Mona Lisa here. Because if you had access to the Mona Lisa, you're going to use it as much as possible in your video, right? So the camera is focusing on the Mona Lisa and it pulls back. She's again, probably one of the most recognizable women in Western art history. And so it pulls out to display this sort of triangular vision of three faces. And they all share this same coy expression, right? It's not quite a smile. And Beyonce and Jay-Z are just as calm as she is. They are shirtless in their pink and blue suits, which is you know, they're kind of hanging out with the Mona Lisa. This is a notable exception to the massive crowds that often vie for a very short glance of the Mona Lisa. I think you can look up online the galleries are usually very, very full, and my understanding, I've never been to the Louvre, but my understanding is that it's very difficult to get a quick peek. But they are suggesting a parallel narrative to the one that the Mona Lisa is presenting. They also know what it's like to evoke a form of madness in the people who are listening to their work. And I think if you look at this, they're sort of owning this hysteria that they colloquially refer to as going apeshit. Next slide, please. So another counter narrative that appears as the camera approaches. This is the painting of Ghosts of Paolo and Francesca Appear to Dante and Virgil by Ari Schaefer. So the viewer clearly sees a nude weeping Francesca embracing the mortally wounded Paolo in the afterlife. It's a very sensual depiction of two lovers or former lovers. And then the very next scene depicts what you see on the left, which is this Black woman holding and carefully stroking the hair of her lover on a bed. And then a few short scenes later, we see the couple kissing on top of the same bed, very much alive with a sexual connection and a tenderness that really can't come to fruition in the painting. So they've taken this, sort of beautiful connection between two bodies and extended it into a Black context. Next slide, please. Okay. All right, so another counter narrative, and this is a really powerful one. Throughout the video, you'll see very small snippets of Black men and women who are presented in paintings. And so this is a really small image from a painting that is unknown. I don't think they ever show the entire thing. And in this detail, you see Black hands and a frayed rope that are held, which serves as a sort of foreshadowing for the next scene, in which a Black female dancer who is alone in a gallery is dancing rather ecstatically, extending her hands toward the viewer. And they, of course, are bound by rope. That's a similar color to what's in the painting. And she's sort of alluding to the bodily confinement, I think, that has been experienced by generations of Black and brown bodies, some in the very homes that were owned by the sitters in the other paintings in these galleries. And so the camera pans back to the artwork, showing a closer detail of the rope that's clutched by a brown hand. And at one point in the dancing, you can see that she's sort of very enthusiastically, are we missing a slide? She very enthusiastically sort of extends her body and throws off the rope. So there's a sort of another counter narrative of, this is how we've been depicted in these galleries, and this is, I just want to offer that this is not necessarily reality anymore, and that there are ways that we have, that we need to be challenging these narratives. All right, Joni, you want to go next?
So the video ends with, it concludes with this image, and this image, this painting was created by Marie Benoit, and it's called A Portrait of a Negress. Notably, the portrait is framed by the camera so that it's cropped nearly in half from the original. The original, you can see the sitter's breast. She's seated in a modest Venus pose, and thus focusing on her face, then highlighting her vulnerability. Ending with this portrait is significant gesture. Benoit's painting this portrait during she painted this portrait during a brief period of time in which France abolished slavery between 1794 and 1802. And that short period marked the first time that Black people were actually represented as the sole subjects in art instead of subordinates to white. So you saw, as you looked through the images, the paintings in the Louvre, in the video, you can see Black people in very small spaces underneath white people in subservient positions, serving in the background, bringing things. So highlighting this painting at the conclusion of Ape Shit after almost 5 minutes of viewing portraits and sculptures that are predominantly white people, white figures, is a disruption to the senses. And while Benoit, a French woman of aristocratic lineage, has more agency and freedom than the Black woman in the portrait, the context of apeshit makes this portrait subversive. Next slide.
All right, so what does that all mean? How do we pull this all together? And what are the implications for art museums? I think it's really important that all museum professionals, everybody in the museum, not just curators and educators, but directors and preparators and the people who are doing development and marketing, they really need to think critically about the narratives that are perpetuated in their galleries, both implicitly and explicitly, with an eye toward how Black women and Black and brown folks in general are positioned as subjects, as artists, and as viewers. And I'd like to give an example of this because I think it's really easy when you work in a space that you kind of go through the galleries every single day and you don't necessarily think about the placement of objects because you're just sort of used to it being that way. We had a guest speaker at a museum where I worked who was a Black woman and an art historian. And we sort of casually strolled through the galleries together, and there was a sculpture of a Black body that had been lynched in the middle of the gallery. And if you looked up from a certain perspective, there was a painting of a young girl in France who was holding a little pink baby doll. And for her, that was something that really jarred her senses to see, without any context or explanation, an image of a lynched body that was brown, and then this sort of sweet little girl kind of hanging around in this painting. And it's really important not just to look at things art historically, but to think about how works of art work together and the narratives that they may be producing that are problematic and can be deeply problematic to the people who are visiting those spaces. I think that museum educators and other staff should absolutely encourage the individual and collective practice of performing the museum the way that it's been defined in this article, by actively listening and engaging in dialogue with visitors and embracing the counter narratives that they share. I think so often we are so focused on making sure that we have a particular agenda that's satisfied or objectives that we meet, without remembering that this is a very human experience to be in the galleries with other people and to hear their perspectives and understand their stories, whether it's in that space or online or in some digital way, is a really important thing. I think Joni and I both really feel strongly that museums should make an oral and a written commitment to serve as places of democracy for all of the visitors and their audiences, particularly Black and brown women. You know, their stories are the ones that in many cases are the least heard, especially in these sort of universal museum spaces. And then lastly, museum educators and other staff should see their work in dialogue with local and global communities rather than as something that's merely offered. I spent many, many years thinking about exhibitions and galleries and experiences and programs. I'm thinking about the ways in which we were offering particular experiences to people and not really thinking necessarily about how those experiences would be received and responded to. So changing the way that you think about what you're doing in your community, I think can make you a little more aware of how it might be received and aware of how little other people see themselves in the work that you're presenting. So being open and considering it a dialogue necessarily, or considering it a dialogue rather than necessarily a one-way thing that you're presenting or giving to them is really important. Joni, did you have anything else to add?
No.
Good? Okay. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Joni and Dana. Now we'll take a couple of questions. So one question from Elizabeth: can you talk about Beyonce below Josephine in the David painting? Much of this video seems very much about French history, including trois couleurs, but do you see a political intervention here too? North America as a different kind of colonialism, or something generative about North America and the Black experience as opposed to Europe?
So I think that this is one example of a very specific, I'm not sure that Joni, I'm not sure that Beyonce, what did I just do there? Was necessarily speaking to French history in particular, but I think there's a more universalizing message here, which is that, we're seeing this display of power and prestige, and that there are absolutely people who are absent in it, and that whether it's in a French context or an American context, there are ways that you can bring in other narratives. And I think she's just doing that. I'm not sure that it necessarily matters that it's a particularly French context, other than the fact that it's in the Louvre.
Our next question from Eunice. Thank you so much for this informative session on how Beyonce engages with the representational politics and institutional critique. I'm just wondering, while representation is an important issue when thinking about art museums, if there's a way to think about the historical looting and the contemporary labor exploitation, which I think is at the root of issues in relation to Beyonce. I'm also thinking of this since Judicael Irakoze recently published an essay about the class issues in Beyonce's new visual album, Black is King. The quote, "We don't have to be associated with a monarchy to matter." I'm also thinking of Carrie Mae Weems' museum series where her entrance itself is denied. Denial not only symbolically / representationally, but also materially as well.
So that's a lot to chew on.
Yeah, I don't know where to start with that one either. I do know that article too about the class issues. I can't say that I read it all. Not going too much into that new visual album, but I do think that's an important critique. However, I'm also thinking that the context of that album was about King, and so it was supposed to represent this accelerated this oversaturation of royalty in a way. So I'm not well versed in that area at this moment to be able to comment so much on the critique of that particular work. But historical looting and contemporary labor exploitation, Dana, you have anything to add to that?
I do. So I think it's really important for more than anything for museums to be open and honest about the ways in which they acquired their collections. I don't think it's, in some ways they've been really open about, of course, who's supporting. Like you walk into any museum and there's oftentimes a very large wall of, thank you, son. There's often a very large wall that tells you the names of all the donors who have made the museum possible. But I think it's really important to be quite explicit about the ways in which most museums have gotten the work that they have. And so I think being open about that is the first thing that you can do to start to sort of counter some of these issues. And there's an exhibition that I've seen at the Columbus Museum of Art, which is, of course, our town where we live, that talked about African art and the Joseph Flock collection. And I was really impressed with the way they noted not only how they got the collection, but why they don't have necessarily the names of the people who made the work, or the way that it was acquired, which was often missionary trips or these political adventures. And I think being open in that way about how you've acquired some of these things is really helpful, because it sort of shines a light onto why they're displayed the way that they are and why they're contextualized the way that they are. So that's one thing that you can do. As far as the labor, I mean, honestly, I love that this webinar happened when it did, because right now museums are in a space where they absolutely have been torn down. And this is a moment for rebuilding in a way that's more fair and more equitable and more generative than they have ever been able to be before. And I do hope that we'll take this moment and really think about the way that museum staff are treated in museums in terms of their positionality in the institution, but also thinking about fair wages and remuneration, and valuing the work that all of the different people who are in museums do as a group of people, rather than valuing sort of the expertise of one or two people over everybody else's. Because when you present things in that way, that's when things get a bit skewed.
Taisha asks, thank you both. I'm wondering how you all interpret the presence of Black fashion as an extension of Black bodies in the Louvre, specifically Beyonce's animal print in front of the sculpture of the Sphinx, clips of curags, Jay-Z's gold chains, and a hair pick, to name a few.
Curags, was that supposed to be do-rags? Maybe. I remember do-rags, maybe. I don't know. Yeah, the way I interpret it, I was more mesmerized by the skin-toned tights of the women of color in the video. The simplicity, to me, those images were more impactful than some of the other imagery that was represented, just because you know, it's kind of like you're laying yourself bare with no distractions. So I felt like that was a very intentional moment to focus more on the actual body and the figure, the actual bodied existence of the Black women. I loved the do-rags, the picks, the representation of connection of culture and community, you know, the picks and the do-rags to represent the texture of Black life. The absence of that in the museum is obvious. And I think that, you know, when you think about, you know, as a Black woman growing up, especially in the South, it's like, don't go outside with your hair looking like that. What you think those white people gonna, you know, think? You know, like, comb your hair, or you know, just got to be presentable in this way. And Afro and do-rags, that's not in line with what that representation, what that image is supposed to be like. So to present that very authentically and in that rawness, I felt like was just a bearing of all of those, you know, those restrictions that we've been taught that we can't be outside of our own houses. And to place that in a space like the Louvre, of all places, I think for me that is how I felt about that representation of fashion as an extension of Black bodies. Did you want to add anything, Dana?
No, I'm just thinking about those moments of that you usually don't get to see, you know, of people embracing, or someone, you know, combing their lover's hair or something like that. There's such a vulnerability that's implicit in that. And, you know, no matter who you are, sort of witnessing these moments in a space that's largely public is very powerful. Yeah. Oops, that doesn't have a lot to do with the fashion, but it's certainly, I think, pulls you in as a human being.
Mm.
All right, our final question, which is a combination of questions from Njoki and Kelly. Can you talk a bit more about how Beyonce's visual albums and the museum has been able to expand the conversation about representation and problematic behaviors within institutions, which we are seeing happening right now? In addition to that, you've talked about how museums position their visitors as passive recipients of civilizing narratives where life and art are categorized in periods and Black bodies are often excluded. What are your visions of an inclusive, comprehensive, interactive museum experience?
Well, for one, I'd say one that includes Black voices and their imaginations from the conception of the experience, which even means from the sidewalk of the museum to the bathrooms of the museum. I mean, you know, so many times we try to go in and reform things, but I don't think it can necessarily be done on top of what white supremacy has already been found, you know, what is already created. So for me, that inclusion would be that, to what's ever in the imaginations of Black and brown people from the conception. So I don't know that, because I'm not, I mean, I know what I would like, but but I can't say for what that would look like overall.
I have thoughts.
Okay.
So I don't think that there is any possible way to change what's happening in museums without systemic change, without fundamentally changing the structural goings on of museums. And so at this moment, you know, we talk a lot in the field about diversifying the field, inclusion, but the issue is that hiring some staff of color or bringing in more visitors that are representative of the communities in which you live, that doesn't change things systemically, right? So right now, museums have boards that are they're 99% white. Every single major museum is run by a staff with a group of people who serve on the board. And those faces and those experiences and those bodies do not represent the people who are actually in the community. They almost never do. And so the very difficult work of taking on a new role in society and being very explicit with the people who are running the museum, whether they're employed or volunteering, has to happen. And I've been reading the Ibram Kendi book. I mean, everybody's been reading a lot lately, but I was really affected by his talking about sort of looking at things from a completely different perspective in terms of structural underpinnings of institutions. And until we start to change things structurally, there aren't going to be a lot of changes in museums. And so I think right now people are, we can include more Black artists, we can, you know, tell more stories. And really what's going to happen is we need to start thinking about who is running, who is supporting, who is paying for, who is making decisions, and how we can change the way that looks. Because until we start doing some pretty major underhaul systemically, it's what's in the galleries is not going to change.
And I want to close with that comment. Stefano Harney talks with Fred Moten and he says that the artist is an institution. He needs to be abolished. And so even from the language of art, the artist, you know, that needs to be broken down too. What institutions see as art, the art as an institution is something that takes people outside of what is culturally defined as the arts. And so thinking about multi-sensory ways to produce culture, those types of things need to be included in the definition of art, because the artist as an institution leaves out people. And so if you don't see yourself within that, the way that's been culturally and socially defined as the artist, then it's no point of even having people of color on the board if you don't have the people who are producing culture seen as somebody who needs to be in that space, even if whether or not the cultural production is arts based or not. And yeah, so just thinking about the work of Ruben Fernandez, I can't say the G in his name and I don't want to disrespect him, but yeah, his work is really important, thinking about what the arts do and what, you know, they are. And it aligns with Stefano Harney's assertion that it is an institution, just like any other institution built on white supremacy.
Well, thank you both, Dana and Joni, for sharing your expertise with all of us today. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate your time and your thoughts.